Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Miriam Lizardo, Marketing Programs Manager here at Imprivata, and I'll be your host for today's session. We'll be starting the presentation in just a minute, but before that, I do have a few quick housekeeping items for our audience. First, I do encourage you all to take control of your audience console to make the most of this session. You can move and resize the windows you see on your screen. So, for example, you may want to utilize the full screen option for the presentation window. Also, make note of the icons at the bottom of the screen, as you'll want to visit several of the widgets during the presentation. Clicking on the icons will hide or show that console window. If you click on the Q&A widget to enter questions, you can do that anytime during the session, and we'll leave time at the end to answer them. The resource list widget provides links to other relevant information that you may find interesting. If you do experience any technical issues during the presentation, click on the yellow question mark widget. The audio for this webinar is through your computer, so there is no dial-in, so please be sure that your speaker is not muted. And lastly, everyone who registered for today's session will receive the recorded version of the webinar via email. So with our housekeeping items out of the way, I'll turn things over to our presenters for today's session. Joelle Ocone, Product Marketing Manager, and Joe Finch, Senior Sales Engineer. Over to you guys.
Hey, thanks so much, Miriam. Before we get going into speaking a little bit about our Web SSO capabilities with the latest release of OneSign, I wanted to take a couple minutes here to highlight some of the trends that we're identifying here at Imprivata. And first and foremost, we understand that healthcare is going through a digital transformation. And we've seen it over the years, first with EHR systems, then we saw virtual desktops, then Zero Clients got traction. In fact, many of our OneSign customers are leveraging VDA today. And here at Imprivata, we've been at the edge of that virtual adoption in healthcare, and we've enabled seamless and secure access to these systems. But we're seeing other technologies come into the picture. To address those technology changes is exactly why we've enabled seamless access to medical devices with medical device access. And it's why we've enabled SSO on shared mobile devices with mobile device access. Multi-factor authentication continues to be a key part of accessing applications and security, particularly as users access technology from outside the hospital. But with all these technologies, the one key emerging trend across healthcare has been cloud. Organizations are realizing the benefits of cloud applications. So as organizations are adopting cloud systems, vendors are moving applications to the cloud, and user access to these applications needs to be secure, and it also needs to be efficient, because security and efficiency needs to be woven into the fabric of healthcare. So ultimately, access management solutions need to be purpose-built for healthcare. So those are some of the key trends that we're identifying. But before we really jump into some of these things, again, I wanted to actually open up a poll and get some interactions from the audience. So we have a question here. Do you leverage cloud applications today across your enterprise? And if so, which types of applications? So we'll leave that poll open for maybe just 10 seconds or so. And then right after this, we'll actually share with you guys some of the responses we got from our last webinar. All right, so we'll go ahead and close the poll. And it looks like Office 365 and EHR systems were some of the most commonly used cloud applications today. In the last webinar that we held, Office 365 was still another popular application, with about 74% of respondents choosing Office 365. So it's no surprise. We see it across the board. And in fact, Joe on the line may be able to tell us a little bit more about that once we get to the Q&A later in the webinar. So just moving on to the next slide here, some of the key advantages of cloud applications is a move to a patient-centric care delivery models. Right, hospitals need to be flexible enough. There's key advantages to moving to the cloud because it provides this level of flexibility. Right, there's a single access point. There's integrated and more efficient patient care. There's improvement of management of patient data across the device ecosystem. Data can scale as the organization grows, right? When folks move to the cloud, there's more ability to add new users, add more data as the organization grows. And there's also enhanced security. So typically with cloud applications, there's inherent updates and security embedded within these applications that oftentimes are applied automatically. So it's no surprise why when you look at the research, it's expected that in about a few years, there's going to be about $44.9 billion in healthcare cloud computing. But in healthcare, there's a little bit of a resistance to the cloud. There's some key detractors in this trend, and it's particularly, when you think about it, there's PHI at risk. And so anytime organizations need to protect PHI, they're going to be hesitant about releasing some of that to an outside organization, to a cloud application or a cloud vendor. There's also a difficult and lengthy migration process. So if you think about how interconnected healthcare really is, it's difficult to make that kind of snap of a finger migration overnight to a cloud infrastructure. There's also a fear of downtime. And when you think about the most impactful event for healthcare is a disruption. Any form of disruption is really impactful, right? Your patients ultimately need to be cared for. And if anything gets in the way of that, it's going to be trouble. And so there's a fear of downtime if a cloud application goes down. There's a fear of that really disrupting some of the key healthcare workflows. There's also ultimately a high cost to making this migration. And if these benefits of the cloud are seemingly uncertain, again, it's going to create a little bit of a hesitation for organizations to make the move to the cloud. And so ultimately, the result of this is that even though there's an adoption of cloud applications and there's that hesitation to the cloud, the result is a hybrid environment usually where organizations are maintaining both on-prem and cloud systems. So these on-premises systems are typically legacy systems like EHRs. They require unique API integrations, and these tend to be only accessible from within the hospital or remotely via VPN. But on the other hand, you have cloud applications that are easily accessible from inside and outside the hospital because they leverage open authentication standards. One of the most widely used ones is SAML 2.0. So actually, I'm going to hand it over to Joe Finch here now because we created kind of a guide to SAML, if you will, and we aligned it to an analogy here about trade shows. So, Joe, tell us a little bit about SAML as we kind of talk about cloud access and cloud applications in healthcare.
Yeah, sure, Joel. Thank you, and thanks everyone for taking the time to attend today. One of the big challenges that we encounter oftentimes, especially with those of us who are not deeply familiar with what standards-based authentication means in the context of cloud-hosted environments, is how to describe what SAML is. And the closest analogy that we've been able to come up with that makes sense across most of the use cases for SAML is this trade show analogy, where in essence, when you go to a trade show, when you come visit us at HIMSS, you walk the trade show floor, you want to get that swag for your kids and get those free cookies or the nitrogen ice cream or more information about our latest product suites. Those booths on the trade show floor are a good example of what you might consider to be a service provider as it relates to SAML. So in the SAML world, things in the cloud, Salesforce.com, WebEx.com, any other kind of SAML-capable service providers can be thought of as those booths. So if you slip in the back door of HIMSS, you go up to one of those booths and you want to enter the Imprivata raffle for a $25 Amazon gift card or something like that, the first thing that we're going to ask for is your badge, because we want to scan that badge. And if you slipped in the fire exit, well, you don't have a badge. So we're going to send you out to the identity provider, the registration and badge pickup. And you're going to have to get that badge. You got to buy it, you have to prove who you are, show a driver's license, show a passport. You're going to have to prove who it is you are before the front desk is going to assert your identity, give you that badge for you to go back and enter in that raffle or get the ice cream or what have you. And there's a couple of different ways that this handoff can work. Kind of the most common way is, you come into the front door, you get identified, you take your search from identity and you go visit the show. There's other ways too, and I kind of did that a little bit backwards. What I actually just described as more of a service provider initiated identity process, but in general, this is the best way to think about what standards-based auth in the form of SAML 2.0 compliant solutions, how that's laid out is using this analogy. And don't worry if you're thoroughly confused at this point, we will be returning to this slide a little bit later in the program. But I hope that gives an extremely high-level overview of kind of what it is that we're talking about today.
Perfect. Hey, thanks so much, Joe. So let's take a step back, and let's look at some of those systems that I mentioned earlier that users are accessing. Some are cloud and some are on-premises, as I mentioned. So without an SSO solution in place, users would need to remember a different set of usernames or passwords to log into each application. So again, kind of like the example that Joe mentioned, anytime you want to access a different type of area in a trade hall, for instance, maybe you'd have to remember or bring a different badge or a different type of credential. This is particularly frustrating, this process of remembering passwords across the board. It's particularly frustrating for clinicians, but it's a problem across the entire enterprise for all users. Accessing systems with different sets of usernames and passwords and doing this multiple times per day just really isn't feasible. And so ultimately, the solution for many is to trust a single identity provider for single sign-on. In this case, for instance, let's say user Mark Smith authenticates with a single set of credentials. He would be able to access multiple applications without needing to repeatedly enter a username and password for each of those apps. So for accessing cloud apps, there are some well-known cloud-first identity providers out there, meaning that these solutions focus on streamlining access to cloud apps. And so actually we have another poll here. We'd like some of your feedback here. Are you leveraging any of the following identity providers today? And if so, which ones? So again, I'll leave that poll open for a couple seconds, and once that poll closes, I'll share some of the responses we got from the last webinar. All right, so I'll go ahead and close that poll. It looks like actually not many folks answered the poll this time, so I'll go ahead and share some of the responses that we got from the last time. So it looks like many folks last time were using Microsoft ADFS and Microsoft Azure in terms of their cloud identity provider. So moving forward, right, in terms of access management, most well-known cloud IDPs, maybe Okta, maybe a Ping, et cetera, they tend to fail to address the unique challenges in healthcare, and here's why. So when we think about healthcare, one of the first and most common use cases is a shared workstation, right? So user profiles need to switch seamlessly and consistently as different users access workstations and applications. And also because many hospitals are using on-premises and cloud apps, SSO has to be ubiquitous across these different types of applications. You can't have one process for accessing cloud apps and another process for accessing on-premises ones. It harbors inefficiencies and leads to end-user frustrations. In addition to this, mobility has to be supported, and the workflows for accessing these applications, it has to be consistent, whether it's accessing on shared mobile devices, virtual desktops, or shared workstations, just as we discussed. Clinicians are always on the move, and they need to be supported with a seamless authentication experience. And finally, hospitals need to support the needs of all of their users, clinicians and non-clinicians. So managing different solutions or systems for one user population just isn't scalable or cost-effective for organizations. So this is why we've built Web SSO. So Imprivata Web SSO, we've designed a new integrated component of Imprivata OneSign. And again, I'm thrilled to introduce Imprivata Web SSO, which is a cloud identity provider. It's a solution purpose-built for healthcare. It's available with this new release of Imprivata 7.0, and it's actually pretty some interesting features that I'm actually going to hand it over to Joe to discuss maybe some of the key complexities of our latest and greatest Web SSO solution. So I'm actually going to build this slide out a bit. And Joe, I'll hand it over to you. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Sure. Thanks, Joel. So in essence, what we have done here, what our engineering teams have been able to accomplish is, in essence, we've created a SAML 2.0 compliant, service provider initiated identity provider solution. So what does that mean? So in kind of common language, this means that, let's say I as an end user want to go access a cloud service that your organization provides there. Maybe it's Office 365, maybe it's Salesforce, maybe it's Athena Health. Any number, really, it comes down to pretty much any SAML 2.0 compliant service provider or application in the cloud can be configured to point to our identity provider. So as an end user, I go to one of those service providers that has now been configured. This is obviously post-configuration, post-testing, all that good stuff. I go to, my instance of, we'll just stick with Salesforce. I go to Salesforce, I type in my username, jfinch at Imprivata, and my password. And what it's actually going to do is it's going to redirect me as soon as it detects my username over to the Imprivata identity provider. The Imprivata identity provider is that, going back to the HIMSS analogy, is the badge booth, the check-in counter. So the identity provider is then going to authenticate me, checking my credentials against my organization's Active Directory, and then it's going to assert back to the service provider that, yep, this is a valid user. Go ahead and provide him with the applications that he should have access to, or the rights he should have access to inside of that service provider. And that's pretty much it. Now, there are a couple of unique components which are somewhat alluded to here in the lower left-hand corner with the phone, and more importantly, the desktop computer. So as everyone on this call as Imprivata customers is well aware of, we have an on-prem or several on-prem components of the Imprivata appliances, and most critically, our agent software that is deployed on your endpoint devices. So what we've actually been able to do, and this is unique to Imprivata Web SSOs, we've actually integrated the authentication, the assertion component into the agent itself. Now, that may not seem to make a whole lot of sense on its face, but in essence, what we can do is when your users, and when they're on premises, tap their badge or scan their finger to log into an Imprivata-enabled endpoint, we are actually performing that IDP assertion silently in the background on behalf of your end user. So when your users, again, an Imprivata-enabled endpoint, navigate to one of your configured service providers, the service provider, it doesn't know at all that this assertion has already taken place. So it will redirect to the IDP, but the IDP basically comes back and says, oh, yeah, here you go, without any kind of prompt to the end user. And this is kind of our killer feature in this killer app, is that we can, there's plenty of companies out there who can do single sign-on in the cloud, but we are the only provider who can do true single sign-on with no prompt for your end users when they're using an Imprivata agent-enabled endpoint. And if this is interesting to you, we'll talk a little bit more about how you get Web SSO, where it's available, and certainly you feel free to reach out to your account manager and set up a demonstration or a call with myself or another one of the sales engineers here at Imprivata Sales. So.
Perfect. Hey, thanks so much, Joe. So just moving on to this next slide, we wanted to just compare some of the key features. I think just to follow up on that point that you mentioned, Joe, comparing Imprivata versus other cloud IDPs. The first two here, SSO into SAML 2.0 web applications. Yep. So now with this latest release that we're able to support SAML 2.0, which is, again, one of the more popular authentication standards for cloud apps. Supporting multi-factor authentication for remote logins. Joe, I know you didn't really dive into too much of that, but just at a high level, we do understand that cloud apps are accessible from outside of the network, right? You may have folks accessing a cloud application from a cafe or from the road. So typically, from a security perspective, you want to add a second factor of authentication to really prove the user is who they say they are. It's typically maybe a token, a code that they get on their phone, or maybe a push token that they get on their mobile device. So when you look at traditional cloud IDPs, typically there's an additional license required for that. And so with Imprivata, yes, there is a separate product that we have. It is Confirm ID for remote access, but it is compatible with Web SSO. So again, you are able to get that multi-factor authentication through that license. The key part of this is when you think about multi-factor authentication, when you think about the Imprivata ID app, it's the same application that can be leveraged for EPCS as well. So if you have clinicians that are already leveraging Imprivata for electronically prescribing controlled substances, which again requires a second factor of authentication, that same token you're using for that can now again be leveraged for accessing cloud applications. So it's really cutting down and streamlining the number of technologies that you have to manage. Moving on to the next one here, so single sign-on into on-premises applications, and that's what Joe highlighted initially. With traditional cloud IDPs, because they're mostly focused on cloud applications, it can usually require extensive services just to make sure that the application or the system works with maybe an Epic or a Cerner, et cetera, right? Those typical on-premises applications. Imprivata, we've been well-known, established leaders in healthcare for 17 plus years, and so that's our bread and butter, really, making sure that we enable access to those on-premises systems. So you really can be confident that you'll have streamlined access there. This other piece, too, is pretty important, and I know it's kind of buried in the middle here, but I think it's one of the more important pieces here, and that's integrating natively with an identity governance platform. So for those unaware, and I won't go into too much detail, but identity governance is the concept or solution for provisioning and deprovisioning access to applications, as well as monitoring access, user access on these different applications and systems. So for instance, let's say Joe wants to access Epic. He needs to be provisioned for that, and so you'd leverage an identity governance solution for provisioning him access there. Once he leaves the organizations, you can deprovision him, and then as he accesses Epic throughout his work, you can track and monitor how he's accessing things and pull up audit reports, et cetera. So that's a topic for a different webinar, but what I'm really happy to say is that when you look at Imprivata, we have native integrations with our identity governance solution. But when you look at traditional cloud IDPs, it typically requires maybe integrations with a third-party solution or a third-party vendor. So it really makes that a costly endeavor for IT organizations to manage. And then the last three, just really skimming these three, because if you're on this webinar, you're likely very familiar with OneSign and Imprivata. Batch tap capability is something that is very, very nature and traditional to Imprivata. That's the tap in, tap out, right? There's fast user switching on shared workstations. So being able to tap your badge, multiple users can come into that same workstation, and that switch is performed seamlessly. And then there's finally seamless access into shared mobile devices. And that's a relatively new functionality that we introduced last year with shared mobile device capabilities. So users can tap their badge on a mobile device. So again, it's something that Imprivata supports. When you look at traditional cloud IDPs, that's not something that they really support out of the box. So why Imprivata for cloud access? Really just summarizing this. I know I've mentioned some of this, but it comes down to three key things, right? Better user experience, lower IT costs, and reliable security. So from a better user experience perspective, clinicians never see a login screen on these shared workstations. And because we support SAML 2.0, we enable that seamless login experience for cloud apps without compromising support for on-premises applications. If remote, physicians only need one MFA app on their phone. So again, that's making that seamless experience for them. In terms of costs, again, with one platform, if you're an existing OneSign customer, there's no need to deploy or maintain anything new. You already have the platform and the capabilities you need, and with an SSO/AM license, you get Web SSO included. There's no need for any additional licenses or standing up an additional appliance or anything like that. I will say you do need to be on the G3 virtual appliance if you're running version 7.0 or later. So I know some of our customers may be running slightly older versions, so you will need to upgrade. But again, if you're on the latest and greatest version already of OneSign, you've already got the appliance, and you've already got the licenses needed for Web SSO. We support MFA modalities, again, I mentioned, for remote access and for EPCS. And you can leverage this Web SSO capabilities across your entire enterprise, not just for your clinicians. So if you've got IT, if you've got business, if you've got back office workers that are leveraging cloud apps, you can leverage Web SSO for those folks as well. And then finally, just a couple bullets here around security. Domain and application credentials are never stored in the cloud, and we provide that seamless integration with identity governance for tracking and monitoring those different identities across your network. So I want to cover one other slide here, which is our customers are already having success with our solution. Now, I want to highlight a couple customers here. I won't go into too much detail, and I've anonymized some of the information here for privacy's sake for the customers. But we had a customer in Long Island who their CIO wanted to create an employee portal for all of their users. That portal needed to support cloud and on-premises apps, and they wanted that accessible from any device and from any location. The challenge was that they didn't want end users to download software into their systems. So if you're leveraging a VPN for tunneling, right, access remotely, they didn't want to have users download a separate VPN application. They needed 2FA for remote access, so two-factor authentication. And other traditional cloud IDPs, they were just too expensive for them. So the solution for them was our Web SSO functionality. That integration with Confirm ID for remote access was key. And they really believe in that portfolio of Imprivata. And so when they leverage and deploy EPCS, they're already going to be set for that when they realize, again, when they see that they're already leveraging that same token and that can be extended for those EPCS workflows. Then we have another customer in Newark, Ohio. They were an Imprivata champion. They've got 2,800 SSOAM licenses. They were adopting cloud technology, and they needed to enable access into the apps from any device and any location. So, again, they looked at Web SSO functionality for, again, that same seamless experience on-premises and cloud applications. So I know I've highlighted a couple customers here, and I know I've highlighted some success. So I want to just make sure everyone understands there's some important details of the solution. It is included with a one-sign license. So with Imprivata 7.0, if you're on the latest and greatest version and you have an SSOAM license, you already have Web SSO capabilities. As long as, again, you're current on maintenance, you can leverage this new functionality, and it's compatible with Microsoft Azure Active Directory services. So I know that many of you, as you saw in today's responses, poll responses, are already leveraging Office 365. So our solution integrates seamlessly into Office 365 as well for SSO. The one final slide here I have before I move on to Q&A here with Joe is, we really do think of ourselves as the digital identity company for healthcare. When we look at the solutions that we provide, it really is a platform. We understand that there's different users, that there's devices, applications, and locations that all change constantly. And that's why, again, when we think about the solutions that we provide, we think about it as a platform. And this is the latest example of how we enable purpose-built solutions for healthcare. So Web SSO is a great example of us really pushing the envelope and taking that next step to enable your digital transformation to the cloud. So with that said, I talked quite a bit. I did want to open it up to Q&A. And as I Joe, you and I kind of go back and forth. For the audience, feel free to ask questions. And we'll try to get to your questions as well as possible. So actually, let me flash that slide again that you had at the beginning there, Joe, while we just kind of pepper you with some questions. Sound okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, perfect. Hey, so starting off, what are the most popular cloud apps you see our customers using today?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty wide range, but I'd say, far and away the most important one is the Office 365 suite. That's pretty much ubiquitous. We see that in probably 97% of our customer bases. There's other, things like, I believe UpToDate now supports SAML 2.0, certainly some of the more common like payroll and HR platforms. I believe ADP is on that list. I know that there's a couple of others out there that are starting to support this because they tend to be mixed market. They're not solely focused on healthcare. One of the things that we tend to see, unfortunately, is that a lot of healthcare vendors tend to lag in their support of these standards. Whereas, more public, more multi-vertical companies like folks like ADP, UtiliPro, they tend to be quicker on the draw, so to speak, to support, new standards when they come out. I do see, one question that has popped up here in the Q&A here from someone asking about G Suite. Again, I can't imagine a world where Google does not support SAML 2.0, but the answer to the do you support it question kind of across the board is if it supports SAML 2.0, we don't foresee any issues integrating with Imprivata Web SSO. And again, there are some nuances to this. There are certain service providers out there that I believe only support IDP-initiated SSO. We don't support that model today. We only support service provider-initiated SSO, which again is kind of along the lines of, the example where your user navigates to a particular web portal and is then redirected to an IDP for authentication. That is service provider initiated SSO. So I hope that answers the question with regards to the G Suite piece. Another question that we've seen pop up here in the Q&A is whether Azure multi-factor authentication can be integrated with Imprivata. That I can actually confirm as of today is not something that is supported. We are a close partner with Microsoft. There's much that's being explored in that partnership as it grows. But at this time, if you're using, for example, Microsoft Authenticator, you're taking advantage of some of their geofencing and IP blacklisting capabilities, all sorts of different things along those lines. Yeah, unfortunately, that is not something that we're able to integrate with today. You would be able to use our Imprivata ID token to satisfy the multi-factor auth components, but the Azure MFA does have some fairly advanced capabilities that to be perfectly honest, are not reflected in the Imprivata ID platform now. So unfortunately, that's where it stands today, although that certainly may change in the coming year or so. Some other questions. This has popped up in actually a few different folks had asked us, with regards to the relationship with Cerner. Does the Web SSO capability feed it all back into, the ease of access into Cerner? Perhaps it's Cerner CommunityWorks, which is kind of a new-ish offering on the Cerner side. The short answer is somewhat the same as my prior answer. If they support SAML 2.0, sure. There's no reason at all why it wouldn't be able to be used in a Cerner environment. That having been said, I don't know that that's the case. So I would encourage you to reach out to your Cerner account representative and ask them whether SAML 2.0 compliance is baked into the framework of the Cerner package that your institution currently has or subscribes to, because that would really dictate whether or not we're able to do anything with Web SSO in a Cerner environment.
Hey, Joe, one other question we had for you was around those workflows supported with Web SSO. So I'm wondering, I know in the last webinar we had, we gotten tons of questions in terms of how do we support shared workstations. So tell us a little bit about the experience for a customer trying to access cloud apps on a shared workstation. What does that look like? I know it's a broad question, but I guess just tell me a little bit about user one logs in, what happens next?
Yeah, so on a kiosk workstation, which as most of you are probably quite familiar with, we use a shared local account, a local Windows account, something that has usually fairly low permissions. Use that to overlay with our Imprivata agent and use that as the jumping off point to gain access and provide a single sign-on to applications delivered on those kiosks. It's really quite simple. We would work with you, or the customer can work internally to, in essence, push out customized web links to the applications in question. So there's a million different ways to do this. In the case of things like Office 365, Microsoft has this concept of a smart link, which in essence is a link that contains specific information that's hard-coded into the URL that will allow, in essence, you to skip the kind of initial portal.office.com experience that you're probably all quite familiar with, and really drop your users directly into the instance of that app that is specific to your Azure tenant. So you push out these smart links in the case of Office, or maybe just direct links in the case of things like Salesforce or ADP or whatever, that in essence drop your users into your instance of that app. And then as soon as that happens, what should occur is and again, this is on an Imprivata-enabled workstation, that app should recognize that, hey, I'm coming in from, Acme Hospital, redirect to Acme Hospital's pre-configured IDP, in this case, the Imprivata Web SSO configured IDP. Because of the aforementioned integration with our agent, what should then happen is our IDP will report back that the user is already authenticated. Now, this is kind of our value add here. So, in essence, and again, we can set up, follow-up conversations with those of you who want to see this in action. We've got some pretty good recordings, which unfortunately I don't have loaded into the presentation manager dashboard here. But in essence,
we actually have a link, by the way. We have a link. So, yep. So, Miriam, I think there is a link available for folks to be able to click into it if they want to. Yep.
In the resource section, yeah.
Even better. So, click in the resource section, and you can actually see this process. Yeah, blinking, you'll miss it. But basically, there's a little bit of URL magic occurring where first the service provider hands off to the IDP then hands it back to the service provider then loads the resource that's assigned to the user. So the reality of it is, it's all occurring within the web browser, and it's all being controlled via the IDP. And on a user switch, our standard operating procedure on a kiosk workstation is to close all open web browsers. So if you approach this from a very deliberate fashion, like one of the recommendations we make is ensure that these links are set to open up in incognito mode in the case of Chrome, or private mode in the case of Internet Explorer. When they close, everything's gone. So that kiosk is really reset to a completely neutral state on a user switch, and there really is nothing that's being shared between users that can be shared, because it all exists in the context of that browser session, which is closed by the agent. So it's very clean. It's a very clean workflow. It's great for shared workstations. Obviously, there's going to be a subset of your user population who's going to need more thick apps. That's a bit of a more complex discussion that we would honestly want to kind of have on a case-by-case basis. But in general, I hope that gives kind of a view, combined with the video that has been so thoughtfully provided by Joelle and Miriam here, to give you an idea of what this might look like in your environment. And again, the best part is, guys, this is not a paid add-on, right? You upgrade to really what is the latest version today of Imprivata OneSign 7.0 and higher, ultimately. And as long as you have an SSO license, this is a native capability. We've made the decision not to sell this as an add-on product, so you can try this out. Assuming you are current on support and maintenance and can, schedule that upgrade, maybe do it in test first. All you're going to need to do is reach out to the support team to get your cloud connection provisioned on our side, and you're off to the races. That's it.
Yep, that was great, Joe. And hey, one other question. What about virtual desktops? I know we got that question last time quite a bit. Anything that's different if you're accessing a published desktop on VMware? What about if you want to access cloud apps through that? What happens there?
Really nothing. At this point, I mean, you'll get the same experience, the same seamless pass-through inside of that virtual desktop, but fundamentally, unless I've grossly missed something, there really isn't much in the way of a true cloud desktop available today. Now, that having been said, obviously, VMware, I believe Citrix, soon Microsoft, are all going to be offering, desktops in the cloud, kind of as an elastic, maybe as elastic capacity for an on-prem solution. And there are SAML authentication components built into some of those brokers. We have supported those for some time. That's not what Web SSO is really about. It is still obviously SAML. It's a different, honestly, product, if you look at it from the perspective of our virtual desktop access product, than this, and it doesn't really apply in the context of what we've been talking about today. So it's somewhat outside of the range of kind of our discussion.
Sure. So just to confirm, so let's say I have a WebEx application, or I want to access WebEx. When I've logged into an endpoint, a virtual session, pops up, right? If you're using Imprivata, you've tapped your badge, you've gotten seamless access into that virtual desktop. If you want to access WebEx through that virtual desktop, that virtual session, tell me a little bit about kind of what that experience is like if there are cloud apps delivered through a virtual desktop. Are you saying that's not available?
No, it would be exactly the same as you would experience on a kiosk workstation. The same customized links get pushed by your administrators into that gold master image, and they're just available. I mean, in a pure sense of the word, it should be as seamless as possible. It's a cloud app. It should be available anywhere. And if you're using a resource that includes our agent, we're going to make that experience even better.
Yep, exactly. Yep, that confirms it. I think there was a little bit of a potentially a misunderstanding there between your first response and that one. Yep. Hey, so what about accessing remotely? I know we didn't really cover this too much, but let's say then I want to access WebEx on my own personal desktop while I'm at home. What's the experience there if I have Web SSO?
Yeah, it's pretty much identical. The only difference is that it's going to, because there is no agent on that home computer, and we're talking here about a true home computer, something that is not owned by the institution. It's not a laptop that you carry home that has our agent on it. All that's going to happen is when you go to that service provider and it redirects you to go get your badge, go get your assertion of identity, you're then just going to have to log in using username, password, and if desired, the second factor of the Confirm ID for remote access token. So the push notification to the smartphone for that second factor, and then you'll be brought in. You're only going to be entering in at that point your Active Directory username and password.
Perfect. Yeah, and by the way, for folks in the audience, that is also part of the video. If you access that video and the resources, you'll be able to see that experience as well. Hey, there's a question that just came in, Joe. There's a question around profiling our traditional application profile generator, maybe using that for cloud applications. Tell us a little bit about the difference between the traditional approaches with APG and perhaps this new support with Web SSO for SAML.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the question itself is really like, well, why wouldn't I just profile the application using the current profiling tool? There's no reason you can't. It's absolutely 100% supported. You can do that. Most people, and unless you are in the early access program and have used this today and are using this today, that is what you're doing. The shortcomings of the APG are pretty prominent in these examples because, for example, we need to have focus on the screening question to log the user in. There's no focus needed with a standard spaced-off model. It doesn't help me if I'm off premises. So what happens in that home scenario where I'm logging into the cloud app and I don't remember my username and password because for the past month, the only times I've accessed that application are on Imprivata agent-enabled workstations, and the credentials have been pushed in for me. I don't even remember what my username and password are. You can do it both ways, but that's one of the main reasons why we're providing this feature for free as part of the SSO, the SSO licenses, because it is a better way of doing it. It's going to be inherently more reliable than the APG because we are not dependent on nuances of focus on the particular fields within the application. We don't need to profile the multiple screens in an application from login to the login success to the password change success, and you never have to update it unless something pretty drastic happens on the service provider side that breaks the integration. Everyone on this call, I'm sure, is familiar with being at the mercy of your service providers, your application providers. They love to change things. Those changes will and often do break the APG profiles that you build for it. It's far better to adopt a standards-based approach where applicable, because obviously this is not going to work for 100% of your apps. We don't claim it's going to. It's far better to do a standards-based approach when you can and reduce that lift on the part of your IT team, your help desk team, and frankly, your user satisfaction.
Excellent. Thanks for that insight, Joe. Hey, so I know that there may be additional questions that come in, but I do know that we are getting near the end of the time. So I don't know, Joe, just kind of final closing thoughts, or in terms of what you see from customers in terms of this functionality with cloud. I know that we oftentimes see customers adopting cloud applications more and more. You know, how do you think that your maybe conversations with customers are going to be changing in terms of you know, this new functionality with cloud? Do you think more folks are going to be asking about kind of, hey, I have this new application? You know, what are some things, I guess, ultimately that customers should know moving forward with this new solution? I guess, you know, tips and tricks for folks as they leave this call.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really does boil down to, A, it's available. Like, knowledge is power, and the first thing, you know, you should be aware of is, look, this is a feature, and guess what? You know, you asked, we delivered, possibly a little later than we would have liked to, but it's here, right? So use it. Make use of it. We want people to know it's available, get upgraded to the latest version. So I also saw a question floating in here, which one of my colleagues may be answering here. Yes, you do need to be on the Generation 3 appliances in order to upgrade to the first release where this is supported, which is the 7.0 release, which came out 2-3 weeks ago. Yeah, you can't get this on the Generation 2s, which are, just as a public service announcement, end of life as of the end of 2020, although if this doesn't convince you to move to G3 in the near future, I'm not sure what will. But yeah, this is one of those things that's just another tool in the tool belt. You know, if you can use it, and if your vendor supports it, we strongly encourage you to move in this direction. So yeah, that's kind of my messaging to my specific customers, the customers that I'm responsible for. It's kind of like, why wouldn't you, if everything lines up, why wouldn't you do this, as opposed to kind of struggling along on the APG, or maybe just not even profiling at all?
Yeah, excellent. Hey, thanks so much, Joe. That was great. And so you know, we'll go ahead and end the webinar right here. I'll hand it over back to Miriam for some housekeeping items. But final things here is thanks everybody for dialing in and joining our webinar today. And as always, if you have questions or want any follow-ups, you know, feel free to shoot us a note, email your account rep, and we'll be happy to answer those. So I'll hand it over back to you, Miriam.
Great, thanks, Joelle. And, you know, just really quick for everyone who joined today, you know, anyone who registered for this webinar will receive, as I mentioned, the recorded version. You should have that by tomorrow afternoon via email. So that really does conclude our webinar for today. I know that Joe is also answering some questions right now, but I think that wraps things up. So thanks again to everyone who joined us, and enjoy the rest of your day.